On October 31st of this year, we were finally graced with the release of Dragon Age the Veilguard, and it's been quite tumultuous, to say the least. The fandom itself has been incredibly divided since day one and continues to be so, but hopefully I can put some fears to rest in this video, or at least provide you with an honest review of the game. To preface this, I do have quite an intense special interest in Dragon Age. It's the reason why I wanted to begin pursuing an art industry job, and it got me out of a pretty low point in my life. Speaking as someone who loves the series dearly and has for nearly a decade at this point, this game was not a disappointment. Not one bit. In fact, I would say that it is probably the best entry next to Inquisition, in my opinion. Veilguard has a spirit about it, pun not intended, that is compelling and inspiring even. This is a game about endings. It is about acceptance, about death and trauma. Just writing this had me in tears thinking about what I have to talk about to make sure everyone knows that this game will change your life, if you let it. It isn't perfect and there are some valid criticisms, but it doesn't make it any less of a great game. And this is your warning. I will be talking about a whole bunch of spoilers for the game and the ending, etc, etc, etc. If you do not want to be spoiled for this game, you should go find another review that is completely spoiler-free. You have been warned. When Veilguard was announced, there was a very vocal minority saying that the game looked too much like Fortnite, and honestly, I chalk that up to a personal preference in game art styles. Also, a lot of people had caught on since Inquisition that Bioware was trying to fix a lot of mistakes that they had made in the past concerning LGBTQ issues and representation, so I would take any review saying that the art direction was bad with a huge grain of salt. Personally, I love the art style. It's a far cry from Inquisition, where everyone looks great, but not polished. If you genuinely don't like the art style of the actual models, that's fair, but we really shouldn't be comparing these two things. Aside from a few facial animation glitches, at least on console, this game is perfect. And if you don't love the rendering, you can't tell me that the opening scenes are ugly. Look at that. The artists who created this game are beyond talented, and I do genuinely want to thank them for making this game. It is beautiful. We have been clamoring since DA2 came out for the loading screens and transition shots to be added into the next game in this art style, and they delivered. The character creator in Veilguard is probably the best one out of the whole series. While a lot of the options I didn't ever touch, as the sliders were very akin to FromSoft games, and I know what happens if you push those too far, I was pleasantly surprised by how much you could change. It seems to be a mishmash of Fallout 4's famous triangle wheel for body types, various FromSoft-like sliders as mentioned before, some Baldur's Gate 3 options like vitiligo and various facial presets, and lots of asymmetry options. I wouldn't say it blows anything out of the water, of course. I do wish you could have had more color options with the eyes and hair, but I suppose that's the problem with coming from a game like Baldur's Gate 3, where there are gorgeous color options and mods to boost them. I'm sure eventually there will be similar mods for Veilguard. I've already seen a whole bunch of outfit recolors, so why not eyes? And we did get dark scleras this time around, so I can't complain too much. The hair options were pretty okay, the physics were beautiful, and I loved the fact you could have long hair options, unlike in Inquisition. However, most of them were kind of basic options, especially if you were playing Qunari. I do think they had massive improvements in their textured hair options though, and at the very least had one or two protective hairstyles. I think my most favorite thing about the CC were the tattoo options, and the fact you could give your Rook top surgery scars. As a trans person, I think they did an amazing job including pronoun and gender options, and it was just the icing on the cake to have the scars. Get wrecked, far-right weirdos. The tattoo options were great, and I liked the fact you could pick different aspects of Valisline or other facial tattoos and then mix them up with paint options or body scars to create your own. The body tattoos were a great addition as well, though I wish I had seen more of Rook's tattoos, but that's on me for playing someone who's always covered up. I think the only parts I didn't actively enjoy about the CC were the fact that the scars looked a bit wonky and painted on, and the fact every damn time I came out of the CC my makeup would disappear. However, that has been patched out as far as I know. The facial scars reminded me of the very strange scars you could give your writer in Mass Effect Andromeda, and while the options are good to have, it was a bit of a jarring experience. This doesn't apply to the body scars, though some of them still do look painted on. I liked most of those options, especially the option to have autopsy scars. Very goth of them. Overall, I would rate this CC a solid 8. Definitely the best out of all of their games so far. Before we get to arguably one of the most divisive things about this game, I did want to touch on Rook's backgrounds and why it's so important to read Rook's backstory. Each of the backgrounds are very well picked, though I would say I prefer the Mournwatch one in terms of personal preference. Let it be noted that each Rook backstory shares a single theme. Each Rook defies social order and is cast to the wayside because they've done something the higher-ups don't like. But also, it shows that Rook is kind, and they are focused on exacting justice for those that cannot get it themselves. My Mournwatch Rook participated in the War of the Banners. The noble dead had risen up and had waged war that threatened the lives of the living, and nobody would do anything about it. Rook stepped in and saved lives, but upset social balance. Rook and the Crows fought against the Entom that had occupied Treviso and saved lives of captives, but was sidelined because it had compromised another team. And the Lords of Fortune, Rook takes care of a corrupt Urvani noble who was working with Venatori, and was told to step away lest the other nobles became angry. Rook and the Shadow Dragon saved a dignitary and freed a group of slaves right out from under Venatori control, but the Venatori noticed them and the organization they belonged to, and they were sidelined. You get the idea. In whatever way they can, Rook does what needs to be done, and does so out of kindness and human decency. I reiterate these core concepts of the main character because much of the fandom critique of Rook has been that Rook is too nice and you can't be an asshole. One of my mutuals and friends on Tumblr put it quite succinctly in response to these critiques. Why would Varric hire someone to be part of his team that was knowingly cruel and unkind when he wants to save someone he regards as a friend? In each of the games, your character has been thrust into a situation that they did not ask for, and becomes the leader when perhaps they never wanted to. But before Veilguard, you could pick the asshole options, which were varying in degree of meanness, and you could also kill off your companions depending on what your character did, or cause them to leave the cause entirely. People have been genuinely upset that this wasn't a thing in Veilguard, despite the fact that it has been spelled out by not only the devs, but the story in general, that the Veilguard is the only group that can save the world. Rook is thrust into this position by accident, but they have enough wherewithal and kindness to know that they have to make this work. And really, which one of these characters do you truly want to kill? What kind of person wants to tell Emmrich that he's an idiot and that his fears don't matter? What kind of person tells Bellara to stop being so caught up in her guilt over her brother? I will also point out the Rook can be mean. They can be incredibly blunt and even rude. You can tell Harding that you think her magic is weird, and she can become incredibly defensive, even anxious about the fact you think this about her. You can tell Lucanus that he is a liability for something that he never asked for. He was tortured for an entire year, and you genuinely want to be mean to him? You had your asshole options. You can piss people off, but if you want to play a character that slaps a man so hard he leaves the Inquisition, this isn't the game for you. Veilguard is about finding acceptance in the end of things, and finding the strength to save the world with a sheer will of kindness. But I suppose the fandom will literally complain about anything. Arguably one of the worst things that they've done to this game. The 3-option situation. You can only pick what your Inquisitor looks like if they disbanded the Inquisition and who they romanced. From the outset, this looks bad, but it's not as bad as you might think. The south of Thedas eventually gets entrenched in the Blight, so therefore the Inquisitor will be very busy, and most of the story options from previous games don't really matter if you're fighting disgusting creatures straight out of fantasy hell. While it would have been nice to have nods towards our choices instead of Bioware's choices, it makes sense that regardless of if our hero Ferelden is alive, that everyone in Denerim and Orlais and the Free Marches would need to be incredibly focused on fighting Darkspawn instead of petty infighting. Inquisition is largely a political game with a war campaign slipped in. Veilguard is a game about fighting a literal apocalypse on your doorstep right now. What I do think they should have put in was the quest to save the person you left in the Fade, as they did mention it in the concept art book. But otherwise, they do put in a lot of rational reasons as to why your choices won't come into play within Veilguard. Like I said, Inquisition was largely political and focused on the south. Some characters from DA2 were mentioned, and while it would have been nice to have Merrill and Fenris around, definitely an oversight, it still makes sense as to why that game's choices don't factor in. Same could be said for Origin's choices, as everything in that game is 1 in the south of Thedas and 2 largely political. Some Zevran and Sten content would have been nice, but the both of them would be fighting the Blight and quite distracted, no doubt. If anything, the corporation that you should be mad at is EA for demanding that the game be out so quickly after layoffs, COVID, and cancellation of the Project Joplin, as Veilguard was called before it was Veilguard. Anyhow, on to the next section. There are a few glaring dialogue issues in the very beginning of the game where it seems disjointed and a bit awkward, but that disappears quite quickly the more you play. The spots I'm thinking of are when you meet Nev, and Harding. These two parts are the worst offenders, and I can see why people may have struggled through the beginning section, but I think the dialogue sounds like it was written by Marvel directors is a bit too harsh. Even if it had been written in such a way, it was largely offset by genuinely heartbreaking moments, specifically during Tasha's quests, Harding's quests, and Emmrich's quests. If the end of the game didn't make you cry simply from the voice acting alone, I think there's something wrong with you. Veilguard easily has the best combat in any of the Dragon Age games. We've come a long way from the god-awful combat in Origins, where it was so slow I lost my mind to the time it took to wait for my warden to land a second attack. If I had to compare the style, it would be between God of War and Horizon Zero Dawn, both games that I vastly enjoyed. And hey, this time you don't just have to use a staff if you're playing a mage, which is a massive improvement. However, the enemies are a little odd. They were just kind of bland. Sure, there's these weird blighted Qunari, weird-looking Venatori, the usual cut-and-paste spirits, a couple dragons, and an updated Deepstalker model, but they all kind of seemed like they were non-issues. They have no substance to them, really, unless they pertain to story missions, and the Darkspawn are really the only ones I find deeply interesting. This doesn't make it hard for me to play the game. It's just a fact that doesn't make the game more than what it is. I do think they make up for this in the Razakale fight, who I personally think looks absolutely wild. There are several forms to it that look disgusting, and the fight actually feels terrifying to be part of. The other boss fights that achieve this, or at least did so for me, were the Hezenkost fight, the Gloom Howler / Isaiah fight, the Red Lyrium Harding fight, and the ending boss fight of both Gillenane and Elgar'nan. Speaking of Elgar'nan, I thought it was weird that the Blight was described as some sort of living organism, as since Origins, it's always been described as some sort of magical virus, or at least an illness. There seems to be slight conflicting information about the Blight itself, but I'm okay with accepting that maybe these are different strains of it, which are the OG Blight, the one we've seen across the 3 games that is spread through the Darkspawn blood, the Red Lyrium kind, which seems to be the actual source of the Blight, explained as the Tranquil Dreams / Souls of the Titans. The last strain of the Blight seems to be this weird version that Gillenane has been spreading across Thedas since her escape, with all its weird tendrils, cysts, and rotting vegetation. While I want it explained to me, I do think it's just a symptom of EA wanting the next Dragon Age game to be out that we didn't actually get any actual explanation of these things, which actually kind of makes me feel nostalgic for Inquisition, where lore was expanded upon, explained from the other games, had the most cameos from supporting NPCs, and repeatable kiss scenes. As I played Veilguard, I found myself wishing to play Inquisition at the same time, not because the former was bad, but because it made me love and appreciate the latter even more. And I think that's important. These games are amazing stories, and it makes those of us that love them feel things deeply, and one of those feelings is sorrow. Harding's reaction to Varric's injuries is weird at first. After all, he's there in the infirmary, and she seems to have been in the room with him at least a few times, along with Rook. While Varric is severely injured, he's coherent, he's still there. So why does she sit in her room sobbing, saying that she doesn't know what they're going to do? At the very least, Varric could serve as an interim sort of leader or an advisor, while Rook and Harding are the actual ones doing all the work, right? I thought this at first too, and just assumed that because I'm autistic, I was reading into Harding's emotions a little too hard, and that things were actually fine. However, that wasn't really the case. Keep that in mind as we move on. Each of our companions are genuinely enjoyable, and from the outset, we're given access to Harding, Nev, Balara, and Lucanus. Harding is an Inquisition favorite of mine. I've always liked her intros to each area in the game, and her genuine worry about the Inquisitor in the Jaws of Hakon DLC was heartwarming. I think having her be part of the Veilguard is solid, and to those who are inevitably saying Harding should have stepped up to be the leader over Rook, I like that she isn't. Solas knows her, and I like thinking about the back and forth Rook might have with her over who should be interim leader of the Veilguard. In the end, she couldn't be the leader because Rook was the only one Solas couldn't predict the movements of, but she is integral in getting information and making sure the connections Rook needs are there. She fills the role of Spy Master quite well, and by the end of the game, she had ripped my heart out with her tiny freckled hands. The character I thought was just as bubbly, but was perhaps a copy and paste of PB from Mass Effect Andromeda, was Balara. But good God, was I wrong right off the bat. This sweet woman is not only incredibly smart and ADHD coded, she's a good example of how deep the Veilguard characters are emotionally. Pretty early on, she confesses that she's afraid of not being good enough, and that she blames the loss of her brother on herself. Sound familiar? That was the moment she captured my heart. and her eventual best friend is the infamous Nev, a Minrathous detective that I found slightly boring in the beginning, and once again was so wrong. In Nev's case, I think partially her storyline didn't appeal to me as much because her enemies were not memorable. Her allies were though, and she most certainly was. And of course, our beloved Lucanus. While everyone is clamoring about how short this man's romance is, I think he's written incredibly well, and think that his one kiss scene does make up for his utter slow burn of a storyline. This only comes from osmosis though, as my husband romanced him during his first playthrough while I witnessed it. Lucanus is one of the most well-designed characters, and his voice actor did an amazing job. I enjoy the conflict between him and the other party members as well, especially with the fact he's an abomination. Although Spite reminds me of Gollum in that first scene, which made me laugh a bit too hard. All of Lucanus' outfits are wonderfully crafted, and all around I give him a solid 10 on being tortured, but also hot. I'll mention Davrin here as well, since you recruit him briefly before your first major story plot. I also adore him. There really isn't any companion I dislike, but he takes the cake for me personally, aside from Emmrich, my beloved old man. It was interesting seeing a Grey Warden from the perspective of someone who wanted to be a hero, but he's definitely not two-dimensional. He's very caring and sweet, yet obviously a bit gruff from having faced years of incredible danger. Maybe I'm biased because I romanced Garrus in Mass Effect, and his character writer is the one who wrote Davrin, but I'm having a great time romancing him in my second playthrough. I also relate heavily to a man who has to always be doing something while in conversation. Very ADHD of him. Speaking of Davrin, I thought that going from his recruitment quest to the option of choosing Treviso or Minrathous was actually a pretty good choice. Out of all the story beats, I think this one has a seamless transition and really made me pause when I first played the game. There weren't many spots where I did that in the entirety of the Dragon Age games. It reminded me of the choices we had to make in Mass Effect. In fact, most of this game reminded me of the way the Mass Effect trilogy has you picking between things in an increasingly nerve-wracking way. Picking between Minrathous or Treviso means that certain NPCs and questlines won't be available to you, not because you pissed someone off, but because they're gone, or they pass away because of your actions. Again, regret is a concept that Bioware games do incredibly well, and this one is no exception. I had to watch several NPCs become blighted and then put them down because of my decisions. This isn't treated as a one-off thing either, at least when you pick Minrathous and Treviso Falls. It's a concept throughout the entire plot that you lose NPCs you originally saved before this first major plot point, and I really enjoyed that. The only thing I didn't like about the choice between Minrathous and Treviso is that the boss fight was a bit of a letdown. I expected a near-overwhelming boss battle and story mission, much like Adamant Fortress, The Loss of Haven, or the Temple of Mythal, but this mission was 10 to 15 minutes on normal difficulty, and the dragon was lackluster. My husband picked Treviso over Minrathous, and I was honestly a little disappointed that Gillenane was present in both places regardless of who you picked to save. It would have been cool to see Elgernon in her place if you had picked Treviso over Minrathous or Minrathous over Treviso, but I understand that from a story perspective, it probably wouldn't have worked. Either way, there could have been some sort of nice compromise instead of a 5-minute dragon fight, but it's honestly not the worst thing on the planet to go through, and compared to the other story boss battles, maybe I should be happy that Bioware held our hand instead of just throwing us into the deep end. Losing Lucanus after Treviso fell was sad. I did enjoy his character, and he genuinely seemed upset about the loss of his home. Taya and Viago are really interesting characters and quite charming, at least to me, so I felt a bit like my parents were mad at me when the crows took casualties, though I think it would have been worse if I had done something like this to Antoine and Evka. I love them so much as supporting NPCs, and after reading their short story Into Winter Nights, I was happy to see them in the game. I love Orlais and its culture, so seeing Antoine in the game was perfect. However, losing Lucanus was greatly overshadowed by my joy in finally getting the quest for Emmrich Volkarin. For those who don't know, I romanced the shit out of this old man. He is perfect, he is everything, and I am so glad I chose him first. While all the Lucanus girlies were losing their minds because they only got to kiss him once, I got to jump the old man's bones 3 times. Anyway, the aesthetic and style of the necropolis was perfect for me, who loves all things necromancy, and Emmrich was heartbreaking right from the start. You can't place a man in front of me that's deeply afraid of dying and not expect me to love him, but I'll go into depth with Emmrich a little more in the romance section. Once I secured my senior citizen, I went to go get Tash, and boy was I not disappointed. I know Tosh is a divisive character for the fandom, but I love them dearly. As a non-binary person with a combo of autism and ADHD, I relate quite well with Tosh, and I was so happy to see positive representation finally in my favorite game series. Don't get me wrong, I love Krem from Inquisition and Varric, who comes up in Veilguard, but it was nice to see that there was a companion that understood their gender identity the same way that I do. You won't find any character hate on this channel, but you especially won't find any Tosh character hate here. If you want my in-depth response to the fandom's criticism of Tosh, you can watch that here. This game isn't for everyone. I will keep reiterating that. A big thing I hear a lot of people talk about online, especially on Tumblr, is that for some reason this game has been oversanitized, or the companions are shallow, as well as their storytelling. If I have to hear that this game was oversanitized one more time, I fear I might implode. But for me, I was not only glad that there was little to no overt racism or anti-Semitism, as there was in all 3 of the previous games. As a Jewish person, I was a bit taken aback that there were rumors that my villain was consuming awful things that real people have accused my own people of consuming. Glad to see that in 10 whole years, they've managed to actually take that out of the game. There are other ways that these characters struggle in this world, and they do still struggle with their identities. It's just that people are not throwing slurs at them left and right like in the Winter Palace, which also leads into this fact that people keep saying that for some reason the companions don't hate each other, or that there's no conflict between them, and therefore the writing is horrible and it's a bad game. You are so incredibly wrong if you think that. Sure, gone are the days of Anders straight up telling Fenris to leave this plane of existence by his own hands, and Morrigan telling Alistair that he's stupid as a bag of rocks, but we haven't seen that kind of behavior since Dragon Age 2. We had larger conflict between the companions and Inquisition. Sarah and Vivienne disliked Cole, everyone had beef with Solus, and Solus had particular beef with Iron Bull, but I have yet to see people criticize Inquisition banter the way that they have criticized Veilguard banter, as if everyone gets along for some reason. Those people clearly didn't take Lucanus and Harding out in the beginning or the middle of the game, where Harding specifically says she has an arrow for taking care of demons and implies she'll use it on Lucanus if she has to. Davarin also makes several sets of comments about getting rid of Lucanus if he so much steps out of line. I think I would classify that as a similar comment to what Anders said to Fenris. Wouldn't you? They are making direct threats towards a man who was tortured for a year and fed something that made him become possessed by a demon, who also did not want to be within Lucanus in the first place. That's some pretty heavy shit if you ask me. There's some lighter, but still very much there, conflict between Tosh and Emmrich, and there's normal conflict between everyone else. But I do want to point out again that this game is not about people having issues with each other. It's about people finding their identities and working through all their regrets and trauma to then put it all aside in a final battle against forces of darkness, because they are the only ones that can do so. Sure, all of the Dragon Age games have been like this, but we also haven't been told from the outset before that your protagonists had to be kind and were picked for being so. It would make sense that your companions would also have to be this way, at least marginally so. They all have their problems, but they know they need to work together to make things right, and they don't have a lot of time to do it. In Origins 2 and Inquisition, it said that it took at least a year, up to half a decade or more in 2's case, to fight against the forces that the protagonist was handed. In Veilguard, you had weeks or several months to do so. Immense character conflict wouldn't really be good in that situation, now would it? Anyhow, this could all be chalked up to EA only giving Bioware about 3 to 4 years of development on Veilguard after the cancellation of Project Joplin, which was the MMORPG version of the game. That may seem like a lot of time, but it isn't when you're making a huge game with a lot of player expectations and EA executives breathing down your neck. A lot of things get cut or changed when a good game gets put out. A lot more is going to get cut when you're faced with a time crunch, layoffs, a pandemic, etc. But I guess we're not ready to talk about that as a society, because everyone wants to complain, and complaints get more attention than positivity. Anyway, to further invalidate internet opinions, anyone saying that Veilguard wasn't dark enough did not play the game for very long, or they expected there to be Dark Souls or Bloodborne-like issues from the very beginning. Funny coming from the people who want the game to hold their hand and tell them everything about the world instead of reading the codex entries, but I digress. Dragon Age the Veilguard is probably the most overtly dark entry in the series since Origins. We have a sentient Blight that is threatening to cover all of Thedas and is constantly evolving. It even has a mind of its own, or it's implied to have one. There are cosmic horror-like beings affected by something we cannot comprehend within the Black City, roaming about and turning people into darkspawn. We have demonic rituals taking place, blood magic out the wazoo. We're blatantly dealing with the idea of mortality. There's death, sorrow, destruction, sickness, identity problems, regret, and loss permeating this game. It is soaked in it. We see that from the moment we entered Demeda's Crossing. It was shocking to land over a barrier and see just how different smart the world seemed. If that didn't convince you, all you have to do is get to Weishaupt, where you're tasked with the first real and anxiety-inducing mission in the game. There are hordes of Darkspawn, a real sense that the commander is being affected by the calling, and you have no idea who is in charge until you realize that it's you. Davrin, from the moment he sees Razakale, says that he's ready to die. How is that not dark? Anyone who says that it isn't needs to get their eyes checked. Once you get through gathering your companions and picking Treviso and Minrathous, you do really get into the meat of the game. There's a lot of amazing content, you get to meet really cool NPCs, and the quests feel like you're trying to help people or at least clean things up a bit. While I do wish there was more content to the quests in general, especially the companion quests, I do see this as a symptom of all of the EA stuff that we talked about later and not really a reflection of what the devs wanted. I would have loved more content from Harding's quests in particular, as we don't get to see a lot of Kal Shirok or have it explained as to why Volta is now inside of this giant statue, although it could be that I didn't read enough codex entries. I need to get back to my second playthrough so I can do that. If anyone actually does know why Volta is stuck in the statue, let me know in the comments. But in general, it would have been awesome to have more expansion on the lore and have the game take more time with the companion quests especially. They all have so much love put into them and they deserve just a little bit more. What I have no criticisms of is the fact that some of the companions do get together with each other. Harding and Tasha's relationship was very sweet, and I was devastated when I made a certain choice at the end of the game. We'll go over that soon, sadly. Nev and Lucanus was a somewhat boring choice, but they are also pretty sweet together and do have a little bit of chemistry. I just think it wouldn't have been my first choice for either of them, which would have been Nev and Bellara and Lucanus and Davrin, but I get why he would end up with Nev. I mean, just look at her. What I was super surprised to see was that Emmrich and Strife, of all people, get together. My husband had this happen to him in his playthrough as I was romancing Emmrich, so it couldn't happen to me, and the scene was so sweet. I'm glad they included something for him and didn't leave him to the wayside just because he is an older man. I do wish there was something for Bellara and Davrin. I think it was a letdown there, but considering they didn't have a lot of time, I wasn't really all that surprised. Speaking of romances, I think anyone who romanced Astarion or Gale in Baldur's Gate 3 should romance Emmrich. Not only is he incredibly kind and clearly a man that is very into his books, he also has a lot of great flirtations within the game. Everything from the kiss in front of the lover statue in the Grand Necropolis to the little date he asks you on and showing you the veil as he sees it. It's just perfect in my opinion. There's so much for you compared to other romances. Even now that I'm romancing Davrin, I see a discrepancy in the amount of kiss scenes at the very least, although I'm just now past Weishaupt, so that could change. The only thing I felt was missing were repeatable kiss scenes, though I suppose their dialogue system was a bit different than the other games. What I do really enjoy about the difference in approach to romance is how well they handled Emmrich's decision to become a lich. We're led to believe that this is what he truly wants. It'll alleviate his fears about dying, and it is his life's work, yet in the end, he would have to choose between himself and Manfred, who is practically his son. Unfortunately, I made the choice of letting Emmrich become a lich, and I say unfortunately just because it personally made me really sad when I heard that he was crying over Manfred and that everyone else, including Spite, missed him. I seem to have committed a cardinal sin. Whoops. Anyhow, I highly recommend romancing Emmrich if you haven't already. His storyline is an absolute blast, and there's a Dark Souls reference, so I kind of have to give it a perfect rating. It's one of my favorite games. I gotta get this out of the way, and it's probably one of the larger sections that I'm a bit nervous to talk about, the Inquisitor and Morrigan section. While a lot of people disliked the way that the Inquisitor interacted with Solus, regardless of their decision to stop him at all costs or save him, I'm actually pretty happy with the way my character was portrayed. I romanced Dorian, so I was glad to see a little bit of interaction between the two of them as the game progressed, and honestly, the South getting overrun by the Blight was a really good way of not only showing that the stakes were incredibly high for the Inquisitor and Rook, but it was also a good way of making the story about Rook rather than the Inquisitor. Every moment I had to record or screenshot my Llewellyn, I definitely did, and I was not disappointed. I wasn't all that disappointed with Morrigan's portrayal in Veilguard either. She was just as cryptic as ever, and it would make sense to me that Kieran, who is now in his 20s, would probably be helping the Inquisition rather than be with his mother. While I understand some people would be upset at no mention of the Warden if they romanced Morrigan, we don't know where they are, and again, EA didn't give them a lot of time to consider things, so unfortunately we might not ever know what happened to them. Though I think we might if EA lets Bioware actually make another Dragon Age game. That is a point that I go back and forth on now that I finished the game and also know that there will be no DLC for Veilguard at all. Wishful thinking aside, I do think there will be. Especially if people start to be just a little more positive about it. I think what's really grinding people's gears has actual solutions that they're just not looking for. Time and time again, I've said that people need to be reading the codex entries, they need to be reading between the lines in the dev interviews rather than having the world is ending reactions when they take their responses at face value. This game is about regret. It's about finding your way through that regret and facing it. The only way you can properly do that is by doing the side quests. You have to find Solus's memories, his regrets. You have to look at the murals and actually discuss what's going on there. The reason why this story exists is because he and Mythal created the Blight. They unleashed it upon the world by making the Titans tranquil, and everything came crashing down because of that. The Veil, the state of Thetis, the elves not having their immortality, and the fate of Mythal are all intrinsically tied to Veilguard's story, and it is what makes the game beautifully tragic. It makes it a game about healing and making something better. And I think that these games go through a cycle of making people uncomfortable or not meeting their personal expectations, so they lash out. But in time, when people realize that Veilguard is great and it is a perfect tale of sorrow and healing, those that are in power will understand that Bioware should be allowed to tell more stories like that. The one thing that I do hope that Bioware actually fixes is the racism, especially when it comes to the elves and the Qunari. Both of these groups are based off of real cultures. The elves are a mixture of the Celtic people, the Romani, the Jewish diaspora, indigenous people, and plenty of others. The Qunari were based off of Swana and Asian people, primarily those who are Islamic and Muslim. These groups are the most hated in all of Thetis, and the latter, the Qunari, are particularly hated within the fandom. It's quite upsetting to see, honestly. While I think Veilguard did well in some places with getting rid of overt racism and bigotry, it still had issues with Orientalism. Putting Isabella and a majority of the Lords of Fortune in this armor was certainly not a great choice, and the Qunari once again into a stereotype of mindless animals is not a good look. On top of making Balara feel responsible for things that her god did to her own people and others, and making Tosh choose between their heritages, I can see why some fans of color and other marginalized groups stopped playing the game. I was deeply uncomfortable as a Jewish person, particularly in the case of Balara, but I think this could be changed if they had hired sensitivity readers and cultural consultants. I'm not sure who all was on their council for the game either, but I do know that a big section of them were purely white people. It might be a good idea to hire non-white people the next time they make a game. But this has been a pervasive issue since day one, and is also an issue in the games industry in general. If we criticize Veilguard of this, we need to realize that Veilguard is a symptom rather than the root cause of all of these problems. Getting back into some smaller crit I've got, I think that Act 3 was way too short, or rather the lead up to the end of the game was a bit sudden. I understand that they may not have had a choice or couldn't figure out how to move between acts here, but it was definitely something that took me out of the immersion for a second. However, that is where most of my criticism ends. The whole vibe of Veilguard changes when the eclipse falls over Thetis. It becomes gloomy and gritty. It is truly anxiety-inducing. I pretty much felt like I was having a panic attack through the entire first half of Act 3, from the hordes of enemies being thrown at me to the Gillenon battle. Bioware did an amazing job hard-baking conflict and horror into their game, or at least this section of it. Part of that was the music direction. While I enjoyed a lot of the music they made for Veilguard, it didn't feel like it totally fit until I was knee-deep in Darkspawn and whipping my camera around to the next ogre trying to take me out. Whatever they were doing here felt like I was back in the trenches of Mass Effect 2 and 3, which is a theme we're going to stick with here for a moment. Every single companion quest, every single point given to the factions led up to this moment. I didn't know if my friends were going to die or if I was going to get broken up with by my Lich husband. In fact, they inserted a great fight between Emmrich and Rook right before the start of the final battle. It really rattled me. Again, romance Emmrich if you haven't already, you'll thank me later. This whole section of the game was heavy and emotional. It's where Gillenon is felled and Lucanus gets his revenge for Treviso, but the victory is overtaken by an immense sadness when either Davrin, our beloved Grey Warden, or Harding, our beloved Inquisition scout, falls in battle, and it is our fault. This choice is not preventable, it is a massive loss, and it doesn't stop there. It reminds me of when we lose Thane, Morden, and Legion in Mass Effect 3, and it fits perfectly with the themes of regret and sorrow that Veilguard has put us through since the beginning. Even if we are saving the world and are on the cusp of victory, it's bittersweet because someone we love is gone. It's real, It lasts in our memory far longer than true victory. We are then thrust into the most memorable section for me personally, when we find out that Varric has been dead the whole time and we have been lied to since the beginning. Solus, the god of lies and trickery, was in fact grooming us to take his place in the prison of regret. He told us to become close with our companions. He knew Rook was kind and he could exploit that. Not only this, he saw our relationship with Varric, and instead of telling us our beloved storyteller and best friend had been gone, he used that loss to make us his pawn, his Rook. The ending of the first half of Act 3 had me in tears the entire time. It was cinematic and emotional. It made me think I had lost half of my friends in one fell swoop. Nev was blighted because of my choices. My partner and I were fighting. Varric was gone, and Harding, sweet, lovable Harding, who has been there for the Inquisitor through thick and thin, the woman who asked us if we were okay a decade ago after the Jaws of Hakkon fight, was suddenly no more. It was so hard to move on after that, and it shows exactly how good BioWare's story writing is. It is a shame that EA and the higher-ups of BioWare did not allow this writing to be applied everywhere. If this game had more time, people would not be so adamant about it being terrible. Yet we do still have a perfectly imperfect game, at least in my opinion, and that is okay. Veilguard is a beginning and an end. It is about finding your peace within your identity and coming to terms with your past. It is about regret, but it is also about healing that regret. It is about acceptance and understanding. No matter what choice of ending you took, it harkens back to the end of Mass Effect 2 and 3, where you really felt the weight of everything. But hey, at least you saved the world. For everyone that wished to fight Solus or trick him, you absolutely got your endings. You can, in fact, give the world whatever ending for Dragon Age that you want. Regardless of how you feel about the writing with the Inquisitor and all of how Veilguard was handled, I think it has an ending that can be satisfying for everyone. I personally had the best ending without the solo villain ending. To get this one, I convinced Mythal to ally with me without harming her, went through Solus's memories and his regrets. I heard him out despite my pain for Rook, and the world was healed, even if it was bittersweet. There is no right ending, of course, as much as I don't think I'll ever be able to play the sadder endings. I like Solus as a character too much. When I finished my playthrough, I did find out that there was a secret ending, and it solved part of an iceberg that I did for Dragon Age a couple months ago. The executors are actually plot relevant. You see, if you do 3 puzzles and listen to a mysterious voice all 3 times, you get this.
The storm quelled, the sun dimmed, the wolf defamed. At last, we have balanced. Guided. Whispered. And soon, the poisoned fruit ripens. We come.
I think this is amazing, and I really hope that we do actually get another game so that this can be explained. I'll have a separate lore video on all of the endings and updating the lore on the executors, etc, etc, etc. But I would like to note that there may have been an executor under our nose this entire time, Vorgoth. If the powers that be allow the team to continue and expand upon the Dragon Age universe, I think we'll get exactly that. Whatever your opinion on the game itself, please know that real people made this project. It was fraught with problems and affected by the pandemic as well as layoffs. It got cancelled at first and then rewritten. EA gave the team very little time. The AMA on Reddit pretty much confirms this if we allow ourselves to read between the lines. At least Corinne seems to share a lot of the same opinions that we as fans did, especially on the Worldstate option issue. I do think Veilguard suffers from something I'm calling Mass Effect Andromeda syndrome. If you haven't played the Mass Effect trilogy, it is a masterpiece and was remastered a few years ago. I highly recommend it. However, there was a 4th game and it was shredded by the fandom. In fact, it was shredded so badly that planned DLC was scrapped and was placed into books that nobody has read. This is purely, in my opinion, because the fans did nothing but complain and expect the game to be exactly like the original trilogy. It did have its problems. The CC wasn't groundbreaking. For some reason, the original only gay man in the game has a baby with a straight woman, instead of allowing room for your writer to be a trans man or have a baby through adoption or regular surrogacy. An alien companion who comes from a purely polyamorous and bisexual culture was straight before being added as a bi-romance in a patch after fans yelled enough, and in general, it was a game about colonization, but it was not a bad game. And it did have a great story, and it had really great characters in it as well. And it also had cosmic horror thrown in there. But nobody talks about this game. Not in fandom artwork and writing, not ever. And I think it's a slippery slope for Veilguard to fall to this too. So many people automatically said they would hate the game because it was stylistically wrong to them. The combat and companions weren't what people thought. You can't be mean. And for some reason, everyone hated the option to be trans. But you have to understand, ideas and series change. They evolve, and we need to accept that. There was an interesting post I saw on Tumblr several weeks ago that went the reaction to every Dragon Age title since Origins. DA2. I hate this game. They didn't talk about the Warden, and the lore sucks, and everything is boring and too short and awful. 5 years later, DA2 has arguably the best writing out of all the games, and is my favorite one. DAI. I hate this game, and its combat and the story sucks, and the lore makes no sense, and my favorite characters aren't mentioned. 5 years later, I love DAI. These characters are so amazing, and the combat isn't so bad actually, and the writing is actually great. DATV. I hate this game. It's so bad. And this is exactly what I've been saying since the game dropped. People want to complain because it gets attention, and we're all chronically online with no critical thinking skills. There are things I wish Bioware had done differently. I wish there were more world state options, expansion on the characters and quests, and I wish we knew more about the Evanuris. I also wish they would get the racism out, but that's it. I think they did the best with the time they had, and the devs made an amazing title regardless of its imperfections. Maybe I'm Delulu, as the kids say, but this game is solid, and it's safe to say I love Veilguard. I give Veilguard a solid 8 out of 10, and I thank you for coming along on this journey with me and sitting through me rambling about it. All of my socials are in the description down below, and I hope you have a great rest of your day or night or whatever. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.